going into this, I think too often our expectation is either that it's going to implode or explode, or everything's going to be resolved. And I think not necessarily either of those things are the outcome. So is to go into it, to say what it is that you need to say, and then to listen. I think if you're truly being reflective, you do need to listen, but also to recognize when that person is not interested in what it is that you have to say and has no intention of changing, because then again, we get back to the reality of the situation, which is that where to from here.
This week on Great Conversations, I have the absolute pleasure of welcoming Leeanne and Micheline Ntiru. And we're doing something a little bit different this week. We have decided to have a panel discussion on a topic that's been coming up quite often, which is, how do you work with somebody that you don't like? But before we jump into that, we're going to start our conversation today in a way that we always do, with a question from our previous guest. So, Micheline, I'll start with you. You've been banished to Mars. You can only take one person with you. Who is it and why?
Oh my goodness. First of all, it's wonderful being on this podcast with you and with Leeanne. Okay, so banished to Mars. It's going to have to be a new boyfriend, my partner, Victor. He's so practical and resourceful. We would find, construction materials and build a house on Mars or something. He'd do most of the work, of course. So yeah, I'm going with Victor.
Love it. Leeanne, what about you? Who are you bringing with you to Mars and why?
Hi, Nix. Thanks for having me. I can't take anybody to Mars. I'm giving up my position because I can't choose between my kids and my hubby. Yes, I think I'd rather give up my place on Mars and give it to Micheline and Victor. What to you next? Who would you take to Mars?
Who would I take to Mars? Oh, do you know who I'd take to Mars? Trevor Noah. Hey, Trev. I think oh my gosh. Because imagine the conversations that I'd have, and he'd make me laugh, and he's obviously super hot. So, we'd do a lot to try and make sure that the human race continued. Yeah, I'm going with Trev. I'm going to go Trevor Noah. That's who I'm bringing with me. I mean, so it's, in some ways, it's really easy to think of, well, it is easy. People that you love and that you want to spend time with, it's easy to sort of say, yeah, I definitely head off to another planet with you and spend all of eternity together. But we all obviously have those people in our life that maybe get on our last nerves, and we find being in relationship with them is extremely difficult. So it's something that we've been hearing a lot from our clients, and it's actually a real issue that we've been working a lot with clients on, is this concept of what happens when there's somebody, an individual within a team that's maybe disruptive, that you don't like, and that really causes a lot of tension, both personal tension and anxiety, but also tension within a team and, within the culture of an organization. So I just would love to hear from both of you. What have your experiences been like in the past of working with somebody that maybe you didn't particularly like?
It's quite easy to come up with a time and an example of a person that you didn't like, and I think that's important for its own in its own right, because it is something that sort of sticks with you and is it resonates all the time. You say, have you ever worked with somebody in a team you didn't work well with? And immediately the person's in your mind and you can sort of pinpoint them. And but on reflection on that, what I got to thinking about was that I was the same person for her. And that was really interesting. And when you look about I look back to our sort of conflict resolution attempts, and really that she was reflecting back to me exactly what I was saying about her, and I think it's really interesting that we, when we operate in teams, it's no longer about the individual, and we all impact each other, and that energy goes around, and it's definitely worth exploring just how there could be personality issues, and you're not going to get on with everybody. And how do we navigate that? How do we first, allow ourselves to have a courageous conversation around, this is not going so well, but then also to acknowledge our part in that relationship, is that it's not a single entity. It's not just that person having an impact on you. When you're in relationship, both people are affecting each other. And I think there's something really interesting in that area as well.
It's really interesting what you said about, you think that you would be her person that she would identify that she didn't get on with as well. That's actually a really interesting observation. Micheline, what about you? What's your experience been in this area?
I think about a senior person that I just couldn't stand, and now in hindsight, a couple of things, could have helped me. In the moment, the only way I dealt with it was to go and complain to my BFF on a Friday night over drinks, and to just constantly feel like, oh no, I have to go and meet with this person. And so it took up a lot of energy, and it probably made me exude a lot of negative energy. But in hindsight, I think a couple of things are helpful to remember. One is, why don't you like that person? And so now I've sort of list the reasons when this has happened, in more recent times. They're just obnoxious. Okay, what's in that obnoxiousness? Right. So, for example, really show-offy, extremely arrogant, egotistical characters, just generally, broad sweep, I realize that I don't like. And it's helpful for me to list, sort of those adjectives, why somebody's just bad, let's say. And then if this particular one comes up, the obnoxiousness, I know that for me is an extreme pet peeve. Obnoxiousness in the sense of arrogance and ego, an big ego. And so I know, just looking at it and saying, okay, this is a pet peeve for me. And so it's going to feel horrible. It's going to hurt more than it actually hurts for somebody else. Do you know what I mean? Because it's the part of me that is so sore. And once I have it down, I'm like, okay, that means that everybody else might be experiencing this person in a way that is, manageable, and I'm having an outsized reaction to them. And just reasoning, it doesn't seem possible in the moment, but putting some distance to it and saying, okay, then it might be a bit of me, not them. This is a pet peeve just for me. So that's one framing that I like. Is list the why they're horrible, and see if it's because there's something in you, that is the extreme opposite of that, or that is constantly allergic to that.
I love that. And I love what you're both saying, because the level of self-awareness that you're bringing into the conversation is really inspiring. I mean, I remember there's, my own personal example of an individual that I really didn't like, and I really struggled to work with them. And if I think back then, it was a time in my life when I hadn't gone on this journey of self-awareness and really understanding my own values, my mindset, my limiting beliefs, how they impacted my behavior. And so a lot of what you're saying really resonated, because in that relationship, it was a lot of externalizing. The bad person was him. It wasn't me. He had all the issues. I was incapable at that stage of my life to accept personal responsibility for the dynamic of our relationship. So it was 100% his fault, not my fault, which is quite interesting now. And also really unaware of why. And I think that's what you're both speaking to so beautifully, is actually taking the time to understand and to think, what is it about this person's actions and how they're showing up that is bothering me? Like, what is the impact on me? And using it as an opportunity to really learn and get curious, because obviously what I know now is that, the only thing we can control is our own response. I can't control somebody else's behavior and how they're turning up, but what I can control is how I respond to that. And I think that's what you're both talking to so beautifully, is actually when you're in a dynamic where you're working with someone that you don't like, it feels as if the first step is to maybe pause and to get really curious. So talk to me a little bit more about that. Lee, what would your advice be in that respect?
I think what's coming up for me certainly while you're both talking is that inside of an organization, it's a different kind of microcosm than you would have in the real world. Is that any of us in the real world, there's more choice about the people that you align yourself with. So, Micheline, like what you're speaking to in your example is very much about that sort of value alignment and personality alignment. And I think what we find ourselves facing in the organization is that we're forced to work with people who we wouldn't usually choose to be in our circle of friends or associates. And it does beg the question, like you say, Nicola, is that we can't change other people. We can only really change ourselves. So I think what comes up for me there is really leadership and about building leaders who are able to recognize those dynamics in their teams as well. And Mish, I mean, I'm going to address like what you've spoken to, because when it becomes a relationship of seniority where it's actually the person in the leadership position that you're struggling with, that's a particularly difficult one. But first, let's talk about colleagues. So there's so many issues that come from this, and I do think that a lot of I think we sort of joked about it before, but I do think that a lot of people who are not wanting to return to the office, I think if we really looked at what's going on, I do think that for a lot of people, it's the interpersonal relationships, which are actually just overwhelming, or they take up too much energy, and it's not what people want to do. You know, people have this idea of the work that they do and what they want to do and what work's going to look like. And never do we really consider that all of these interpersonal relationships are going to be or take up so much of the time that we do spend at work. And really it's a critical component that's overlooked when it comes to the workplace. Micheline, you know, when you're in a position with somebody in seniority, like what do you do in that situation? How do you address that? And I think it ultimately it comes down to, you know, we've spoken about it before, but having courageous conversations, HR support systems that you can go to say, you know, this is the situation and we need help mediating it or getting through it. And I think that is at least what one can expect, and to be supported within the organization. And isn't it so interesting that that's what we feel? So just because of a relationship with another person that's not going well, suddenly we feel unsupported by the organization. And I think that's what the organization has to recognize, is that we don't necessarily blame the other person. I don't blame XYZ for being like she was in the relationship. But what did bother me is that I didn't feel supported necessarily by the organization in terms of how to navigate that relationship.
As you both speak, I reflect, on how difficult all this really is, to have the maturity to say, I'm going to self-reflect. This person's bugging me, but I'm going to sit down and I'm going to be a big girl or a big boy, and I'm going to list, a whole bunch of things, including, where I might be to blame. And then I'm going to go back in there and, somehow it's going to feel better. It obviously, in theory, sounds doable, but in practice, it is quite difficult. So what's coming to mind for me is hierarchy. My example, with someone senior, and Leeanne mentioned there should be some structures in place, where when push really comes to shove, the organization, whether it's HR or, someone else can be enlisted in helping to navigate this. The thing, though, is that oftentimes these organizations know, companies know, if there's a really obnoxious, boss that happens to be, making the biggest, the greatest results for the quarter, they know this. And so you also have to be prepared to not get any help, unfortunately. And I know this doesn't apply across the board, but realistically, I've seen this time and time again. So then that's that. It's at worst, if the company doesn't do anything, how can I manage this person? And that's where that reflection really becomes important. And that's where I was saying things like some distance. Don't sort of expose yourself to the things that would bug you even more about that person. The worst case scenario, right? Let's say it's your peer or, let's sort of forget seniority for now. But if somebody is really egregiously horrible, right? We've talked about microaggressions. We've talked about bullying, I think, in other discussions we've had informally, and if these kinds of traits are repeated, then I think, yes, there's going to HR or the ombudsperson or, whoever can help. But I think ultimately it's approaching that person as well and being willing to have that difficult conversation that says, on ABC occasions, do you know that you were actually quite a bully? And the impact that your bullying has had on me and on the business is this. And this is how I'd like you to stop.
I love what you're saying, because that is the definition of courageous conversation, isn't it? And I like to, I do think that inherently we're all good. I don't think that I think there are very few people in the world that are intentionally set out to be bad. And I really like what you're saying, Micheline, because I think oftentimes we're so unaware of the impact that our behaviour is having on other people. And so, to your point, sometimes when somebody else is courageous enough to share that and to say openly and honestly, this is the impact that your behaviour is having, it can have huge, profound effects on the individual.
It's very difficult because work obviously is a critical component of our lives. It's where we make money and how we feed our families. We don't want to do anything or behave in any way that would jeopardize that. So I think that's what makes these conversations that much more difficult to have, as well as the fact that we're sort of addressing people on a level that is very much about, like, this is the impact that you're having on me. And it's never nice to tell somebody else that actually their behavior is unacceptable for you. Because like you say, Nicola, I think a lot of the time, and this was my experience, a lot of the time the perception between behavior and impact is where we have to get to in order to see what's actually going on. Is that there are times that you can work with somebody, and why is that same person having no impact on the person sitting next to me, but they are impacting me? That is where we have to go. Like, it's something about me that's being bothered by this behavior. That isn't to say that the problem is necessarily with me, but exactly that is that when you have that conversation and say, listen, this is my experience. When you do X, I feel Y. Can we talk about that? Because it's making my work life untenable. It makes me not want to come to work. I know that you're not a bad person, but when you do X, I feel Y. So can we talk about that? And I think it's incredibly difficult to have that. And it's not only with people that we necessarily don't like working with. I think that is with your staff. When you have to have those conversations, I think often we forget that leaders are people too, that bosses are people too, and that these difficult conversations are as difficult for people in leadership positions to have with their team as they are to have, the other way around. But ultimately, most times, those conversations lead to real enlightenment and real change and lasting change, because everybody that I've ever met appreciates honesty. As long as it comes, and this is the massive disclaimer, as long as it comes from a place of love and authenticity. And if you go into that conversation wanting to hurt the other person or wanting to be right, you're not going to have a positive outcome. But if you go into that conversation with the intention of resolving what's happening, with the intention of building a relationship after this conversation, you will see different sets of results.
Exactly. And, so I thought of something as you spoke, the reasons why, one of the reasons why organizations have sort of cultures and values, and not so that you can have, respect, trust, integrity, blah, blah, blah. It's not just to have those on the wall, but hopefully, to be able to live them, as well. And so, in giving feedback about how one's behavior is just not on, I think linking it to anything around the values or the culture can be, really, really powerful ammunition to have, to say, again, this is what you did. Hopefully have 3 examples. I'm a big believer in 3 examples, because you want to give it the chance that, they had a bad day. So you don't just go with one example of the occurrence of, of an annoyance. Go with your 3 examples. These are 3 occasions it's happened. This is the behavior. This is the impact on me. This is the impact on the business. And also, hey, our values are respect. And given I've shown you how disrespectful you've been those 3 times, I just, if it's a peer, you'd be having the conversation around, like, that's just not on for the team. That's just not how we do things. If it's somebody below you that you happen to be supervising or managing, hopefully you can link that to, I don't know what's going on, but that behavior is not on. And we just cannot, continue to have you perform well, but these are really important for us as well. Now, if it's your boss that's doing it, that's obviously the difficult conversation I was going to say, where you can say it, but you also have to be ready to have whatever consequences. If it's a toxic environment, for example, and your boss isn't hearing it, and they're like, I can do what I want, I can be disrespectful, and who are you to tell me X, Y, Z? Obviously that gets into some really horrible stuff. But I did want to link it, to the values and sort of, core cultural traits that organizations might have.
I've been reflecting on when I was given feedback, and there's been times in my life when people have taken me to one side and said your behavior is destructive, and they've given me feedback which has been really difficult for me to take. And I was thinking about the difference between those conversations where, whilst I was devastated to hear that, I took their feedback and reflected and moved forward. And those times when I didn't and was like, sod you, what do you know? And just sort of walked away. And I think 2 things were present in the conversations. It's what you said, Micheline. I think the first was facts. And so actually, feedback, like real factual information that was recent. So not, oh, you did something like this, but it's really vague, but really grounding in that meeting last week, this happened. So that factually there's no ambiguity. It's not a story. It's not their version of the truth. That there's a fact there. And then it's definitely what you said, Leeanne. It was how it was delivered. It wasn't judgmental. It was, this is in service of our relationship. I want this relationship to grow and flourish. I want the best for you. I'm delivering this with love and with compassion. So it's not judgment. And oftentimes as well, when we go into these conversations, we have our own agenda. So I want the outcome to be X. And then you shut down, and so you're pushing that, and if the outcome of the conversation isn't X, then somehow that makes you feel not great. So I think there's something really important as well about how you say it, but then you also step back and you're not invested in the outcome of it. And maybe that's where the partnership can show up at the end as well, as like, okay, well, how are we going to move forward? So if we know that we have to work together in this environment, we have to deliver these outcomes. I've shared with you the impact that I'm experiencing in our relationship. Where to from here? And be open to collaborating on that and coming up with some solutions together, some of which may be something that you haven't maybe anticipated. And so How would you recommend somebody navigating that?
I'm so glad you added that, because I agree with you 100%, is that going into this, I think too often our expectation is either that it's going to implode or explode, or everything's going to be resolved. And I think not necessarily either of those things are the outcome. So is to go into it, to say what it is that you need to say, and then to listen. I think if you're truly being reflective, you do need to listen, but also to recognize when that person is not interested in what it is that you have to say and has no intention of changing, because then again, we get back to the reality of the situation, which is that where to from here? So you can ask that question. Okay, you now know where I stand, where to from here, and see if you can come up with any creative solutions to how that works. Or you need to decide where to from here, and this is the reality that I think so rarely gets spoken about, which is that we choose to be where we are. And if that environment is not conducive for you and it's not good for you, we need to choose to be somewhere else. And maybe organizations are seeing this, and that's why they're struggling with retention rates, because people are saying, well, I'll just move on to somewhere where I am appreciated, or where I do feel like I'm making a contribution, or where I do enjoy working with the team that I'm in. Or they don't. And then you're seeing people who are really not motivated. They've tried, they've done what they can, they've had the courageous conversation, they can't find another job to go anywhere else. Now they're sitting in your organization, and they're demotivated, and they don't know what to do, and they feel helpless. And these are not high-performing people anymore. And I think often in organizations, we hear people saying like, oh, but this person, when they started, they were amazing, and they were just like, and now look, how did this happen? What's wrong with them?
But there's also be ready to be now targeted when the sort of system is not going to rise up to protect you, and be ready to be targeted as somebody who has told on someone, somebody who's gone against the system. And that's a difficult one, because yes, there's this quiet quitting and stuff that's reported. But if I'm sitting, say in Africa, as I am, we also have really high rates of unemployment, and we also have the fact that people simply need to work. So sort of have to put all of that in the sieve and say, so if I go and have this difficult conversation, and this is a culture in which I might be targeted as being a rabble rouser, maybe it isn't worth it, right? Maybe it isn't worth having this difficult conversation at the end of the day, because actually I just want to hold on to my job. So honestly, it's so delicate, and I always ask. I try to have really good professional kind of, my tribe of 3-4 people that I can go and cry with. Sometimes it's within the organization, sometimes it's outside. So people who you can sort of rely on for that mental support. One quick thing I wanted to just say to you both is, actually 2 things. One is, if we're in the position of being able to have the difficult conversation for someone else, and again, I'm thinking of hierarchy where perhaps somebody junior is being, stepped on, let's say figuratively. This is a real case that came to me, where a senior coachee knew that in the general organization, the junior person was, I guess, she was facing, I guess, bullying, microaggression and the like from a senior person. So there is also just looking out for the team and just saying, okay, I'm in a position of power now because I'm senior, but what's going on with the junior people, and being able to speak up for them. So that's just a separate point I wanted to make sure we covered, because sometimes, we're not so observant in terms of what's going on in the organization. We're just sort of tunnel focused on ourselves. And yet, as senior leaders, I think it is important to think about, if I'm a cultural carrier of this company, then it means that I do absolutely have to empathize with what else is going on.
I think that that's really important fact, because I think back to times when I was starting my career. Everything that we're talking to, it's yes and, isn't it? It is so difficult to speak your truth to your bosses. And, particularly at the beginning of my career, when I did experience incidences of bullying. Now when I look back, it was absolutely bullying with my boss, and I was in such a position, the power dynamic didn't empower me to speak up to that, and to challenge that. And in that instance, exactly what you're saying, Mish, is what should have happened and what didn't, because it was obvious what was going on, and peers at her level didn't call her out and didn't step in. And I love what you're saying, because as a part of the responsibility of a leader is around how we're showing up and contributing to the culture of an organization. So, we also need to be willing to call out our peers and to say, no, not on our watch. And you decide what the culture is. You decide how people behave in this organization. I think whilst a huge part of this is being comfortable in your own authenticity and boundaries to advocate for yourself and your needs, also you need that social network around you that can be alongside you and to advocate for you in the times when you find yourself in a position where you're unable to do that. And so I absolutely love what you're saying, Micheline.
It's really about that leadership hierarchy, actually, like protecting employees and holding each other accountable and holding subordinates. It's like that hierarchy is there. And every boss has their boss, except for the one boss, I suppose. But everybody has that, and really, it becomes about a leadership responsibility, and this is what leadership development keeps talking to. Is like these are the leaders that we need to be creating. These are the leaders that we need showing up. Is that they're holding each other accountable, and they're holding this, those who report into them accountable as well. And it is, Micheline, you're 100% correct. Like without that, there are going to be bullies. There are going to be the sexual harassment is going to happen, because who's holding them accountable? Nobody. And it's not acceptable.
It's interesting, like what you said, Lee, about like leadership development, because it's the conversations that we're having, it's the work that we're doing. Very much the request from clients is help us build this term human leaders, which blows my mind. But essentially it's leaders that are more authentic, that are more empathetic, that are adaptable to change, but are also capable of developing and growing the future generation of leaders. I think to sort of navigate through some of these dynamics, the relational dynamics that we're talking about, we're really calling on people to show up, in work in a much more authentic, empathetic way. So for somebody who's listening to this, who's in a situation where they are working with someone that they really don't like, what's the one key takeaway that you would give them in terms of how they can maybe look to move forward and resolve the situation? Micheline, I'll come to you first.
One, reflect specifically on what it is you don't like about this person. Be as expansive as possible in that reflection in terms of those descriptive, words. And then next step is reflect on, is it just that they're rude? Is it that they're rude to me only, or is it that they're rude to everyone? So reflect on whether it's applying to just you, so there's a level of unfairness, or whether it's applying across the board. And then reflect on the organization and its culture, its internal sort of realities, and see whether you're ready to go ahead and have that conversation. I suppose I missed a step. I think in between the kind of listing these things that bug you and the deciding whether you're going to approach the person, I would say speak to a dear confidant about it before deciding on ultimately my last step, which was, are you going to go and approach the person, and make sure you've got your 3 examples when you do, and you're able to kind of lead that conversation in terms of how you'd like things to change?
Okay, so for me, I think that, and we've chatted about a few of these things, but I think first is to actually sit down and reflect. I think that is one of the critical steps, is that to stop yourself from just reacting and possibly, saying things that you don't want to. There are, like we've discussed, big consequences to those kinds of things happening. So if you just recognize in yourself if there is a problem and reflect on that. From there is to be very clear about what it is that's bothering you. And then something that I don't think we've chatted about or sort of pinpointed or defined is that in that reflection is also try to figure out if there's anything that can be reframed. So, do that reframing beforehand. I think that comes from being clear on asking yourself this question. Do I experience this because of something about me, or and is it possible for you to make me feel a certain way? So always question, if you find yourself sort of saying like, you make me feel bad, or you make me feel stupid, or you make me feel inadequate in this position, you make me, it's very difficult for somebody to make you feel any of those things. Well, it's impossible for anybody to make you feel those things. So also ask the question differently. Why do I feel this way when this person behaves like this? And be clear on that, because it gives you 2 points. It gives you what's making you feel that way and the behavior that person's exhibiting that you're interpreting. When you know what it is about yourself that's making you feel that way, again, is there an opportunity for reframing, or is this legitimately it's a reality? You're entitled to have that experience, and yes, then you're happy to go forward and to have the conversation. By doing that, you can be very clear in yourself and sure of yourself, and make sure that you're being reasonable in the conversation that you're about to go forward and have with this other person. You can be sure that you haven't, misunderstood it or are overreacting to a situation. So go through those steps with yourself. I love what you said, Mish, about like having a person that you work with who you can go and talk to. And again, I think that this becomes just a way of also just checking it out. Am I taking this the wrong way? Am I being clear? Or do you also agree? Do you think that this is an unfair way to be treated? So it's an opportunity for getting clear and for reframing certain experiences or questions. And after that is really just, have the conversation and be curious about the outcome rather than, having a clear set of this is how I think things should be. Be curious, be willing to adjust yourself, and also be ready for the fact that not everybody's going to change, and possibly not on the first round either. Take the wins where you find them. So take the win that I was brave enough to have this conversation. Give yourself a pat on the back, carry on, and hope that things do change.
Ladies, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and insight. I think just obviously we all acknowledge how difficult a situation it is when you do find yourself in a situation where you're working with people that you don't like. It's not an easy situation to be in. So compassion and love for yourself, for the situation, and also for those around you. But I think most importantly, we want you to know that you're not alone, and there are things that you can do to navigate that situation that's going to better support your mental health and well-being. So hopefully you've received some tidbits that you can take away and bring into your life, but also a little bit of a plug for Intogreat. We are actually around as well. So, if you did want to talk to any of us, we're always here. We're always here to help you. So yeah, it's important that for me that people know that as well, that there are resources within Intogreat that people can access, both free and paid, to help navigate this type of situation. Leeanne and Micheline, thank you both so much for your time. I've really enjoyed our conversation. Take care. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. As always, I would like to thank my editor, Stian Moritz, and musician, Jamie Jenkin. Sending you all so much love. Bye for now.